Remote work is often described as the solution to burnout. No commute, more flexibility, more control over your time. It promises a better system, one where work fits around life instead of the other way around. And in some ways, that promise is real. People gain time back. They avoid certain daily stressors. They experience more autonomy over how they work and when they work. But something else has been happening quietly in the background. Burnout didn't disappear. It evolved. It became less visible, less structured, and in many cases more difficult to recognize while it's happening. Because when the structure of work changes, the nature of stress doesn't disappear. It adapts to the new environment. One of the most important changes in remote work is where boundaries come from. In traditional environments, boundaries are external. Work starts at a certain time. Work ends at a certain time. The physical environment reinforces that separation. You leave work behind when you leave the building. That structure does more than organize time. It creates a psychological signal. Work begins. Work ends. Remote work removes those external limits. There is no commute, no physical transition, no clear signal that the day is over. Which means boundaries become internal. You decide when to stop. You decide when to respond. You decide when enough work has been done. At first, this feels like freedom. But internal boundaries are far more flexible than external ones. They can shift depending on mood, urgency, or pressure. Pushed slightly later, extended slightly longer, reopened when something feels unfinished. And because each extension feels small, it doesn't feel like a major change. But over time, those small extensions accumulate, until the boundary itself becomes unclear. Remote work removes the idea that work happens somewhere. Instead, work becomes something you carry with you. It exists on your devices, in your notifications, in your unfinished tasks. There is no distance. Even when you're not actively working, work is still present. That changes how rest feels, because rest is no longer separate from work. It exists alongside it. You can step away, but part of your attention remains connected. A task waiting, a message unread, a decision pending. And that low-level awareness is enough to prevent full disengagement, not in an obvious way, but in a persistent one. One of the most subtle but powerful shifts in remote work is how availability expands, not through explicit rules, but through patterns. Messages are answered quickly. Updates happen frequently. Responses arrive at all hours. At first, this feels efficient. Communication becomes faster. Decisions happen quicker. Work moves with less friction. But over time, speed becomes expectation. Responsiveness becomes a signal, not just of communication, but of commitment. If someone responds quickly, they appear engaged. If someone delays, it becomes noticeable. No one may say anything. But patterns define standards, and those standards gradually expand. Availability stretches beyond working hours, not because it is required, but because it becomes normalized. Flexibility is one of the most appealing aspects of remote work. The ability to shape your day creates a sense of control. But flexibility without structure often leads to fragmentation. Instead of a defined workday, work spreads across time. You work in the morning, pause for a while, return in the afternoon, check something again in the evening. This creates a pattern where work is never fully contained. It is always partially active. There is no clean break, only temporary pauses. And because work can restart at any time, the mind remains partially engaged even during rest, not fully working, but not fully disconnected either. Remote work doesn't always increase the amount of work. It changes how that work is experienced. Instead of being concentrated, it becomes continuous. Small bursts, frequent check-ins, ongoing engagement throughout the day. This creates a different kind of pressure. Not intense, but constant. No single moment feels overwhelming. But there is very little space where work is completely absent. And that absence is what allows recovery. Without it, fatigue accumulates more slowly, but more consistently. In remote environments, effort is largely invisible. There is no physical presence, no observation of how work is being done. So output becomes the primary signal. What matters is what gets delivered. Not how difficult it was. Not how much energy it required. As long as results are consistent, everything appears fine. This creates a hidden dynamic. Performance can remain stable, while the effort required to maintain it increases. Focus may take longer. Tasks may require more energy. Switching between contexts may reduce efficiency. But none of that is visible. Only the outcome is. This is where remote burnout becomes difficult to detect, because the workload may not change dramatically, but the effort required to sustain it does. You still complete tasks. You still meet deadlines. But it may take more concentration than before. More time to recover. More effort to maintain the same level of output. That increase is gradual. So it doesn't feel like a shift. It feels like a normal day, repeated many times. One of the more controversial realities of remote work is isolation. It removes distractions. But it also removes shared experience. In physical environments, stress is often collective. People talk, they vent, they recognize pressure in others. That shared awareness matters. It validates the experience. It makes pressure visible. Remote work reduces those moments. Communication becomes scheduled, more formal, less spontaneous. Because of this, stress becomes more internal. It is experienced individually, not always expressed. And when stress is internal, it becomes easier to ignore. Working from home changes how space functions. Your workspace and your living space overlap. The place where you rest becomes the place where you work. This affects recovery in subtle ways, because your environment constantly reminds you of work. A laptop nearby. Notifications still active. Tasks waiting. Even when you are not working, the presence of work remains, and presence affects attention. You don't need to be working to be thinking about work. In traditional work, there is a clear sense of completion. You leave. The day ends. Work stops. Remote work removes that clarity. There is no physical separation, no moment that signals finality. Instead, work fades. And because it fades instead of ending, it can restart easily. You check one thing, you respond to one message, you fix one issue, and suddenly, you are working again. Stopping becomes a decision. And decisions are easier to override than structures. Remote burnout rarely looks dramatic. There is no sudden breakdown, no visible crash. Everything continues. You keep working. You keep delivering. You keep responding. From the outside, nothing changes. But internally, something shifts. Energy declines. Focus weakens. Recovery becomes less effective. And because performance remains stable, the situation doesn't appear urgent, which allows it to continue longer than expected. Remote work feels comfortable. That's part of its appeal. You control your environment. You avoid many traditional stressors. You work in familiar surroundings, but comfort reduces contrast. It makes it harder to detect strain, because nothing feels extreme. There are no obvious pressure points, just a constant level of engagement. And constant pressure is harder to recognize than intense pressure. Remote work removes certain challenges, but it introduces others. It removes physical constraints, but it also removes boundaries. It increases flexibility, but it also increases continuity. It gives autonomy, but it also shifts responsibility inward. These trade-offs are rarely discussed directly, but they shape how burnout develops. Remote work doesn't eliminate burnout. It changes how it forms, from visible to invisible, from structured to continuous, from shared to individual. The pressure doesn't disappear. It becomes embedded in routines, in expectations, in patterns that feel normal. Not through dramatic moments, but through small, repeated behaviors. And over time, those behaviors create something that is easy to overlook, but difficult to escape. Because in remote work, the challenge isn't just how much you work, it's how often work is present. And when something is always present, it never fully leaves.